All right, let's dive into a really fascinating and honestly often overlooked chapter of ancient Egyptian history. We're going to talk about a time of major fragmentation that gave rise to well, a very unexpected dynasty.
And that's a great question, right? Because we tend to think of ancient Egypt as this single, unified, powerhouse kingdom that just went on and on for thousands of years. But the reality? Sometimes it was way more chaotic than that. So this brings us to a pretty turbulent time known as the Second Intermediate Period. This was an era when the central authority of the pharaohs just kind of crumbled. It wasn't overnight, but after years of strain, the power structure just fell apart. And the result was a kingdom that was literally split in two. The old guard, the 13th dynasty, was getting weaker and weaker, really just barely hanging on to the south. And in the meantime, a new rival power, the 14th dynasty, popped up and claimed the north. So the main takeaway here is that the unified rule that made Egypt so glorious had totally collapsed. This split created this huge power vacuum, especially in the Nile Delta, which was, super important and incredibly fertile. Now here's where it gets really interesting. Who exactly steps in to fill that void? Well, the center of power shifts, moving away from the old traditional capitals and right into the strategic heart of the Nile Delta. This new 14th dynasty set up their capital in a city called Avaris. It was perfectly placed in the eastern Nile Delta, which gave them control over all the trade routes and, of course, the massive agricultural wealth of the region. Super smart move. And they weren't just a flash in the pan either. From their home base in Avaris, the 14th dynasty actually managed to control Lower Egypt for decades. They established a pretty solid, even if it was localized, rule. Okay, but this is where the story takes a huge twist. When you start to dig into who these new pharaohs actually were, you find a super surprising origin story that kind of challenges everything we think we know about Egyptian rulers.
Just let that sink in for a second. The kings of this new Egyptian dynasty weren't ethnically Egyptian. They were foreigners who rose up to claim the most sacred title in the land, pharaoh. And the evidence is just undeniable. I mean, look at their names. Yakbim, Yakubhar, those are Semitic names, not Egyptian. They come from the Levant, the region we know as Canaan. And not only that, they brought their own gods with them, worshiping deities like Baal and Astarte, right there in Egypt. And this just perfectly shows you the dynamic that was going on. Egypt's internal weakness and its division created the absolute perfect opportunity for an outside group, these people of Canaanite heritage, to just step in and take over a huge chunk of the kingdom. So what did this crazy mix of cultures actually look like? Well, the artifacts from this period are absolutely incredible. They show this real fusion of styles that tells a story all on its own. Archaeologists have found tons of these scarab seals. They're a classic Egyptian thing, right? A symbol of power and rebirth. But when you look closely, the hieroglyphs on them actually spell out the Semitic, non-Egyptian names of these 14th dynasty kings. Wild. And they even took the most Egyptian symbols and put their own spin on them. I mean, the Sphinx, it's the ultimate icon of the pharaohs. But during this time, we find sphinxes that mix that traditional Egyptian form with very distinct artistic styles from Canaanite culture. And, this cultural blend wasn't just for the royals. It was part of everyday life. The pottery from this era, like these jars, shows a clear mix of Egyptian and Levantine styles. It created something totally unique to this specific time and place. Yeah, this quote really nails the whole vibe of the era, doesn't it? It was a time of huge transition, where old traditions were being challenged and new ideas were flowing in, all happening while Egyptian power was on the decline. So what's the big takeaway from the 14th dynasty's short but really important time on the world stage? What was their ultimate impact on the huge 3,000-year story of Egypt? Well, their reign was pretty short. It lasted about 75 years before they were eventually pushed out. But their existence is a huge turning point. They were a symptom of the Old Kingdom's weakness, sure, but more importantly, they were a preview of even more foreign influence to come. They set a precedent that would really change Egypt forever. Well, it changes it profoundly because it reminds us that history is never simple. The 14th dynasty proves that even the most powerful, most enduring civilization in history wasn't immune to breaking apart, to internal weakness, and to the massive influence of outside cultures. It gives us a picture of a more dynamic, more complex, and, frankly, a much more interesting ancient Egypt.